David Emery is the lead pastor of Harvard Avenue Christian Church, and he just has a phenomenal story to share about his ministry, the leadership that he's been offering to his church, and some real change that's happening in their church, which is leading to growth and health and an impact in their community in a way that they haven't experienced for a long time. Pastors who are listening, you may be leading in a similar experience to what David was experiencing a few years ago. And I just hope that you are encouraged by today's conversation and you will find hope in the discussion we're about ready to have that may encourage you to take some of the same steps in your ministry and in your leadership as well. So with that, here's my conversation with David Emery. David, I am so looking forward to our conversation today, and we're going to talk about your journey over the last few years at Harvard Avenue Christian Church. You're in Tulsa, but what's fascinating about your story, but I know I've heard other pastors kind of a similar experience, was the timing of when you took over your lead pastor role at the church. Could you walk us through that journey? I think folks would be interested in how you got started.
So I was in the same church for 17 years. We had a great run, great ministry. We thought we would wrap it up there. I was at the end of my 50s, and I got a call and said, "Hey, would you consider coming to Tulsa?" And it just felt like the right thing to do. My wife and I, we felt like God was calling us, that we had another church in us at this stage in our ministry after 25, 30 years in. And we were excited about it. We were following a pastor who had been pretty successful, had a pretty good 10-year run of growth at the church. And so we prayed about it and made this huge leap at this place in our life. Left family behind in Kentucky. And we're driving to Tulsa, and the whole world shut down. And the church at that time, was doing all audio. And so here I am, starting a new church, no ability to meet with my staff. And my first Sunday was on the Sunday before Easter, Palm Sunday, and I was alone in a room with 0 people in the room, communicating my first time to the congregation, my first message at the beginning of the pandemic.
Wow. Yeah, I don't think any new lead pastor would envy that situation, David. But yeah, so March of 2020, you landed in Tulsa at the church. What was other than the fact that no one was in the sanctuary that first Sunday? I mean, more generally, what was your assessment of the church when you first arrived? And you're familiar with the 7 phases of the church life cycle that I wrote about in the Unstuck Church book. But, what was your assessment, and what phase of the life cycle would you have guessed the church was in at that time?
So specifically, my call was to begin a new chapter and a new season of visioning for the church. And so they'd gone through a 10-year period. They had a successful pastor who left to go to another call to be closer to family. And so they brought me here with an assessment, and we had some ideas about some things that we need to focus on when I got here. And I've been seen as a visionary leader. And so they were looking for me to come to lead them to their next chapter. I think that the congregation had a very strong assessment of themselves as being in a healthier position than they were. The church was going to need to make some significant changes in order for it to continue on its growth path, because it really was in the maintenance mode. I would describe it lack of vision clarity, truly insider focused. In some ways have run out of space. I mean, financially, extremely healthy. But there was a lack of clarity about purpose, vision, values, direction. It had more of an attractional model. And the staff, there was some lack of clarity around staffing roles. They had a good, strong staff, but we had to make some staffing changes. And so I knew that when I came in, and I knew that there were going to be some challenges because people were really happy with where things were. But I knew that in order to go to a new place, we're going to have to make some changes in order for the church to continue to grow. And I knew immediately there was going to be some resistance to some of that. So suddenly, that's all changed by the pandemic. You can't even address those things because you're not even with people. But here's the thing. Here's the thing, Tony. I'm not sure. I think as tragic as the pandemic was, and as I wouldn't change anything, because actually the pandemic allowed us to make changes we would have not been able to make if I'd not been in that situation. It took me a long time to get my mind around that, because for the first 3 months I was really worried. Like, did we make a huge mistake? My wife was, grieving, but the pandemic allowed us to just stop doing some things that we had been doing and to refocus our energies and do an honest assessment of us. But definitely the church was in the maintenance mode.
Yeah. So, yeah, for those that are listening and are not familiar with the church life cycle, that maintenance phase of the life cycle is when you start to notice that there may be some decline happening in the overall ministry. And it's interesting because you highlighted several characteristics that we see in churches that are in the maintenance season of their ministry. But one of the most fascinating things to me through the years has been the fact that you start to see this decline that's happening in the ministry. And that might show up in a number of different ways. But many times the church is financially very healthy. And sometimes it's the healthiest they've ever been financially. And that can at times maybe overshadow some of the initial symptoms of decline that may be existing in the ministry. So it's interesting that you highlighted among the different characteristics the strong financial health of the church in that season. So what did you do then to begin to turn things around at the church?
Well, first of all, it was just the first year of the pandemic. It was just about building relationships and building trust, and just did whatever I could. I put myself in situations with people. In fact, I called every single family in our church within the first month and spoke to them. And then it was also just the content I was delivering on Sunday morning, making sure that what I brought on Sunday morning was really reaching the felt needs of the members of our congregation. It was a difficult season because there was so much civil unrest during that time period, and I didn't have a feel for the congregation to be able to know how to kind of work where the congregation was on that. So I had to work my way through that. So it was about building trust. It was about bringing some energy and preaching hope into the congregation. And then once the pandemic was coming to an end, began to form a team of people who would do an honest assessment of where we were. We formed a vision team with some of our best leaders. And it was out of that we decided that we were going to go through a specific process. We were going to work with Unstuck. We were going to get vision clarity. We were going to get vision clarity. After we got vision clarity, we were going to then work on our branding, how it is that we brand ourselves to the community, and how we communicate our message to the community. We were going to do a staffing realignment, which meant some staff leave, adding some new staff, reorganizing the staff. And by the way, in the Unstuck process, the most helpful thing that we had happen was that thing at the end, because was with Sarah Booma, who came along and helped us. Fantastic. And now our staff, we are really moving together well in a way we haven't before, and a way I haven't experienced in some other staffs. But we went that. Then we got some. We were working with another group to help us with branding, and then we got some coaching for 2 long-term staff members. We have a children's pastor and a youth pastor, been here for a long time. And we realized that in this new phase, reaching this next generation was going to require us to get some coaching for them. And so right now they're going through a 6-month coaching process with a group that's helping them design their ministry, go along with the vision that we have cast with after working with the Unstuck process.
Yeah, I love that. And it really speaks to one of the characteristics of healthy leaders. Number one, leaders, they see challenges before normal people see challenges. And so it was evident in what you're describing that when you started at the church, you were aware of some of the challenges that were going to be in front of you. But to build a coalition of other people that are invested in the ministry of your church, love Jesus, invested in the ministry, want the church to have health and experience great impact in your community and people's lives. Brilliant leadership move to pull that team together. Let me ask you though, as you started down this road, what's been the most difficult aspect of leading change? And along those lines, were there any surprises for you as you were leading change in the season?
Tony, that's such a great question. I think, let me identify one thing right off that I had to get a level of self-awareness about this. I don't grieve the way other people grieve about change in an organization. So I'm ready to go. Let's go. I'm not grieving where I've been. I don't grieve like that. So I came to a church that was grieving a beloved pastor who was grieving through the pandemic about what had been lost. And so until I came to an awareness that I'm not grieving in a way that our congregation was grieving over the past, I didn't have the capacity to talk to them in a way that I was able to pastor and lead them. So I had to get my head around that they were moving at a different speed of change than I was. And so I had to accept that. But at the same time, I had to fight within every inch of my being the resistance to return to the familiar. I mean, I had to resist returning to the familiar. It had been really easy to just return to what was familiar and what was comfortable and then begin to change after that. So we made a very strategic decision, was to just fight through that and to make some changes coming right out of the pandemic and to work through the discomfort of that. And I think it proved to be the right thing to do. And here was the big one. The big one was that this church had a very long, proud history of a traditional Sunday school program that had been sort of the heart and soul of the church. But they did not have an accurate assessment of where that program was. It was not welcoming to newcomers. We have space for 6 or 7 Sunday school classes, and a traditional Sunday school program does not work and meet the needs of young families anymore. And so our older members were trying to squeeze our younger families into this traditional format. It just wasn't working. So when we came back from the pandemic, we said, for Sunday school classes that want to continue to meet. And we gave them support, but we just swung really hard into a small group emphasis. And there was some heartache around our church about that. And some, for them letting go of that. And I still feel it from time to time. But I would say to people, and I had to be really careful. So we can have 6 or 7 classes with about 70 people in it or 100 people in it, or we can have 60 life groups with 800 people in it. We want to reach our community, and to reach our community, our building and our structure is not making that possible. So we began to work it. And I think the reason that we were able to make this change is because we got some early momentum. Right off the bat, we got 14 life groups going. And then we began to see some growth in the church, some people joining our church and becoming to the church through these life groups. We had some people join the church, become a part of the church before they ever even came to worship because they're already attending life groups. And so we've now hired a minister of discipleship that oversees all that whole process. And that was a huge change. And we were able to do that because we didn't discount what was working for the 2 or 3 classes, and we just continue to support them. But the direction we're now moving is with life groups. And that was a big change for us. So I think that one of the reasons why our church is growing and doing well is because we are trying to aim at gospel clarity, meaning what do we mean when we talk about the good news of Jesus Christ? What is it that we hope for people? So that people have the sense that it's not what we want from them, but what we want for them. And all through the pandemic, we just kept focusing on the felt needs of the congregation. What is the good news for you for your family? And it just has begun to get some momentum. And the momentum has, we had last year, Tony, the best year of growth in the history of the church. It was a phenomenal year. We're now pretty much back where we were before the pandemic, and sometimes then some. But I think it does have a lot to do with some intentional decisions we made and how we focused our energy on on discipleship. We have focused on what we call our discipleship pathway. We've identified 8 core practices that we want to preach, teach, that lead to spiritual growth, as opposed to just the church being an organization that consumes people's time and energy. We think that Jesus makes people's lives better, not just busier.
I love that encouragement. And speaking of encouragement, there are a lot of pastors listening into our conversation, David, and I know a number of them still very discouraged by the season that the church is in. Very challenging for lead pastors in this season on many fronts. But what encouragement would you give to other pastors who may be facing a similar situation that you experienced back in March of 2020?
I think the thing that I would say is you're not alone. I think the hardest part of decline is there is some shame and embarrassment attached to that. Most every pastor I know, they want to reach people. They want their congregations to be stronger. And it is just not easy work. It was not easy work before the pandemic, and what's happening now in our culture and with congregations, it's become even more difficult. And I would just encourage them to reach outside of themselves and even outside their own denominational structures to find some coaching and some help. And not just personal coaching, but leadership coaching. I think that in the mainline churches that there is a lack of leadership coaching. We get great theological education, but just very little coaching in how to lead change, how to cast vision, how to move a congregation forward. That's a real struggle. I also want to say this. I've been thinking about this a lot. It's like, you're going to suffer in ministry. You can suffer for just doing what you've always done and lack of vision, and suffer because you're just trying to go along and get along, or you can suffer for vision. And if you're going to suffer one way or the other, you might as well suffer for something that's going to be meaningful and lasting. And I'll say this to anybody that's like, I'm 61 years old. I got the energy of like a 30-year-old, I think. And I have absolutely had, and I've had a lot of great years in ministry, but this last year in ministry has been one of the most joyful seasons of my life. Don't be afraid to make a change. Don't be afraid to step out into someplace new. Don't be afraid to say, hey, maybe this is not the right place for me. Maybe God's calling me to someplace that wants to go somewhere. If you get to a place, if your church doesn't want to go somewhere, there's a lot of people who are just waiting for a leader to show up. And so I think that, I've been reading through John where it talks about being connected to the vine. We can do nothing without him. And all through the pandemic, I kept telling myself, just trust. God brought you here for a reason. Just lean on him and trust.
Yeah. And for those pastors that have been in long-term positions of leadership, pastoring their congregations, and then faced the crisis with COVID and other things that we've experienced in our culture, the great thing is our faith offers a fresh start every day. And so you can begin the same journey that David and the team at Harvard Avenue Christian Church engaged. Just choose today. Today is going to be the start of that journey to continue to move forward and to really lean into what is God calling us to do going forward to accomplish the mission that he's given us. So, David, thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation. It's been an encouragement to me, and I have to think this will bring hope and encouragement to the pastors that are listening as well.